Calmness, Courage and Duty. The day that Miss James was shown into the front room to sip tea out of the best china cups was also the day that I nearly drowned. "Go and fetch your brother." My mother was referring to my brother Paul, 2 years my junior, not William or George, who both worked on the railway and wouldn't brook any fetching from me. And because we spent so much time together, except for when he was at school, she always assumed that I knew where Paul would be, and she was right. The choice was always the woods, the rabbit warren, or the river. The woods, as the light faded in the evening, was a better bet, the best time for setting and checking snares, and the best time for waiting and watching. Paul knew where all the birds nested, and where the badgers would emerge from their set. He knew where the foxes' dens were, and when vixens were likely to move their cubs. He knew about stealth and about the importance of making approaches from downwind, observing and stalking. He knew about these things because that's what I'd taught him. "Go and fetch your brother." But at that time of the day, I knew he'd be down at the river. I also knew why Mum wanted to speak to him. If stealth around animals is useful, around grown-ups it's vital. Make yourself silent, make yourself invisible, and see where that gets you. For me, it made me privy to a lot of conversations, and I knew why Miss James had been taken into the front room to drink tea from the best china cups. The river was our malign neighbour, still long and languid after a lazy summer. The river had a fascination for us both. We knew of its threat, but always it had the allure of potential treasure. Paul would be down there now, finding the best position, making sure that the sun was not casting treacherous shadows. I had to close my eyes to a squint to pick him out in his favourite spot, bent double up to his knees in the river flow, poised like a heron. On the riverside path, I increased my speed, taking care to make a silent approach. I was less than 20 yards away from him when he darted, a hand movement quicker than a pike, a hit. But then he was struggling to stand upright again, and he slipped and disappeared below the surface of the water. His head emerged and then was lost again into the increasing depths. Now I ran flat out. He wasn't far from the bank, but there was nothing I could chuck out for him to grab. I may have gasped at the shock of cold water, but I plunged straight in, not understanding why Paul's attempts to save himself should be so hampered. My only thought was to get a hold of something and drag him clear of the dark god of the undercurrent. But there wasn't a flailing arm I could clutch. Both arms were wrapped around his chest as though he had consigned himself to his fate. So, instead, I got a handful of sodden hair and put my other hand round the back of his neck and began to pull, only to lose my own footing and slide, still with my clamp grip on Paul, into the wild silence below the surface. And then back clear again, gulping a lungful of air before another descent and a remorseless drag downstream. We were pulled, buffeted and tossed around before finally being discarded, eddied into a shallow and a last chance we couldn't scorn. From here we could reach the river's muddy edge, and together, in our desperate embrace, we scrambled and staggered towards the bank, heaving and exhausted. Did I get him out, or did he pull me onto the grassy sanctuary? I don't remember. I couldn't think. I was curled up in agony, as though someone had run a giant stitch through my upper body and was now pulling it tight. Then there was the coughing, the pain in my chest, and my conviction that now it was my turn to take a two-step with death. I don't know how long I lay on that bank, waiting for peace, but it was not to be. Not yet. I finally turned myself agonizingly onto my elbow to find that the river was still flowing, the wind still blew, and the tall grass was singing. I was alive, and Paul, who wouldn't have been the first to be charmed and swallowed by those depths, was crouched on all fours beside me, wretched, drenched, and smiling. "Blasted fish," he said, "nearly did for us both." And lying beside him was the magnificent salmon, wrestled from the river, which had now breathed its last. We ducked through hedges and nipped across fields on the way back to the house. "Has she gone, then?" He'd taken off his jumper to try and cover his booty from the river. I knew Paul was talking about Miss James, and I nodded. "And was she on about the grammar school, and sitting for a scholarship?" I nodded again, and Paul sighed. "She said as much to me at school. She'll give me extra tuition, she says." It was the burden Paul felt he had to carry. However it was that these things were decided, he'd been given brains. William and George had been granted fine, upright physiques, and had been deemed suitable for jobs on the railway, while I spent my prescribed time roaming wild amongst the fields and fells on the notion that fresh air was what I needed. I knew Paul would do anything to swap places with me, the tyranny of books and the cage in the classroom in exchange for my freedom. But what he didn't know was that I would gladly swap in return. "I bet Mam was all for it, wasn't she?" Maybe she was, but it wasn't as straightforward as that. She wanted the best for Paul, yes, and this was a marvellous opportunity. But she kept talking about the uncertainty of the times, about who knew what tomorrow would bring. And Miss James had nodded gravely, handling the delicate china, before she said that there were some things that neither she nor Mam could affect. The world rolled on, one way or another. "All I can do," she said, "is teach, and all Paul can do is take full advantage of his gifts." Mam had nodded in return. She wasn't going to disagree, but she ended the conversation by saying, "Of course, it is my husband who will make the final decision." Of course, and I knew what that meant.